Welcome, travelers, to Terrors in the Wild, where the line between myth and reality blurs in the darkest corners of the earth. Here, we unravel the most terrifying cryptids, dive deep into chilling horror stories, and explore the mysteries that haunt the wilderness. From shape-shifting monsters to forgotten legends, we uncover the creatures and tales that lurk just beyond the reach of human understanding. So, keep your wits sharp, hit that subscribe button, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. The wild is waiting, but beware. It's not just the animals you should fear.
The Reflection. Asriel Cole didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in curses, bad luck, or anything beyond what his eyes could see. But on his first night in his new apartment, something unsettled him. The place was perfect. An old but spacious one-bedroom in a historic brownstone, the kind with tall windows and intricate crown molding. It was a steal for the price, and Asriel, a struggling journalist, wasn't about to ask why. By midnight, he was unpacked. The apartment had come mostly furnished, with an antique wooden desk, a leather armchair, and, his favorite feature, a massive gilded mirror above the fireplace. It had character, the kind that made a place feel lived in. As he stood in front of it, he noticed something odd. The reflection of the room was exactly as it should be, but when he moved, his reflection seemed a fraction too slow. Not much, just the briefest hesitation, like a lagging video feed. Asriel blinked. His reflection matched him perfectly now. He shook his head, laughing at himself. "Too much coffee," he muttered, turning off the lights. That night he dreamed of his own face staring back at him, smiling when he wasn't. By the end of the week, Asriel couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time he glanced at the mirror, he felt it. Something just a little off. His reflection's movements weren't perfectly in sync. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't obvious. But once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing it. A delay when he turned his head. A flicker of hesitation when he reached for his coffee. Once, he swore his reflection moved before he did. He filmed himself with his phone, testing the theory. But in the video, everything looked normal, perfectly synchronized. Still, the feeling remained. It wasn't just the mirror either. His keys weren't where he left them. His books weren't stacked the way he remembered. Small things, easily explained. Except there were too many of them. His apartment felt disturbed. Asriel tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just exhausted. Work had been stressful, and his editor had been writing him about deadlines. Sleep deprivation could do weird things to the mind. That night, he covered the mirror with a bedsheet. He slept a little better. Asriel tried to ignore the mirror. He really did. He avoided looking directly at it, convincing himself that it was all in his head. Stress, exhaustion, a trick of the light. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The hesitation in his reflection's movements was subtle at first. Just a fraction of a second behind. It was enough to make his skin crawl, but not enough to prove anything. He told himself it was paranoia, that he was overthinking it. But then it got worse. One evening, he sat on the couch, watching TV with a beer in hand. He caught a glimpse of the mirror in his peripheral vision. His reflection was there, sitting just as he was, normal. Then he shifted to grab the remote, and his reflection didn't. His breath hitched. Slowly, he turned his head to look directly at the mirror. His reflection caught up, smoothly, naturally. But he could have sworn, just for a moment, it had been delayed. His chest tightened. "Okay," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "I need sleep." The stress of work, the move, and his lack of proper rest were messing with his head. He shut off the TV, finished his beer, and decided to call it an early night. As he walked past the mirror on his way to bed, he forced himself not to look. Then, just as he was about to turn away, something flickered at the edge of his vision. A movement, a grin. He stopped cold, his pulse hammering in his ears. His hands clenched into fists as he slowly turned his head. His reflection was normal, It wasn't smiling. It wasn't out of sync. But he could have sworn, just for a second, it had been. The breath he had been holding came out in a shaky exhale. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how fast his heart was racing. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. He shut off the lights and went to bed, but he didn't sleep. The next day, Azriel decided to test it. He set up his phone on a tripod, pointing directly at the mirror, and hit record. He stood in front of it, moving deliberately, lifting an arm, turning his head, blinking. The reflection was perfect. No delays, no lag. He repeated the experiment at different times of the day. In the morning, in the evening, in dim lighting. The results were always the same. On camera, his reflection behaved exactly as it should. But when he wasn't filming, when he was just going about his routine, he swore it was different. The hesitation was there, the flickers of delay. And sometimes, just sometimes, he caught something else. A slight movement when he was completely still. A blink that didn't match his own. A smile. It never happened when he was looking directly at it. Only when he looked away, when his guard was down. A week passed. Azriel tried to avoid the mirror as much as possible, but he couldn't bring himself to cover it again. Some deep, irrational part of him was terrified that if he covered it, he wouldn't know what it was doing. Then, late one night, as he sat at his desk writing, he felt something. A pressure, a presence. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned, quickly, and this time he caught it. His reflection didn't turn with him. For a full second it remained as it was, facing away, before slowly, deliberately, turning back to meet his gaze. Not a mirror image. Not him. It smiled. Azriel staggered backward, knocking over a chair. His heart hammered in his chest. The reflection raised a hand and tapped the glass. A sharp, deliberate knock. Azriel bolted from the room. He avoided the mirror for days. Covered it again, this time with duct tape securing the sheet. But even with it hidden, he felt it. Watching. His mind was unraveling. He barely ate, barely slept. Shadows under his eyes deepened. He started seeing things in his peripheral vision, flashes of movement that vanished when he turned. He researched everything he could about haunted mirrors, doppelgangers, psychological disorders. None of it helped. Then one night, as he lay in bed, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. From the living room, from behind the covered mirror. Azriel lay frozen, heart pounding. The knocking continued. Then a whisper. His own voice, but wrong. Azriel, let me out. He couldn't take it anymore. Driven by equal parts fear and desperation, he grabbed a hammer and ripped the sheet from the mirror. His reflection was waiting. It wasn't him, not exactly. The face was the same, but the eyes, darker. The smile, too wide. Azriel raised the hammer. What are you? The reflection's grin widened. You. With a sudden violent movement, the figure in the mirror slammed its hands against the glass. The surface rippled like water. Azriel staggered back. A hand reached through. Real, solid, his own hand, but not his. It grabbed him. Azriel screamed, struggling, but the grip was iron. He felt himself being pulled forward, the surface of the mirror turning liquid against his skin. Azriel couldn't breathe. The mirror's surface swallowed him like ice-cold liquid, thick and unrelenting. A crushing force dragged him forward, his muscles straining, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clawed at the edges of the frame, but his fingers found no purchase. A violent, suffocating weight pressed down on his chest. Then, it was over. He was standing. Azriel gasped, stumbling forward. His hands shot out instinctively to catch himself against the desk. But when he looked up, his breath caught in his throat. The apartment was wrong. It was his apartment, but it wasn't. The colors were muted, as if the world had been drained of vibrancy. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Every surface was slightly warped, the corners too dark, the shadows too deep. And then he saw it. The mirror. On the other side, standing exactly where he had been only moments ago, was the other Azrael, the imposter. It looked just like him. Same tired eyes, same unshaven face. But there was something off. The way he stood, the way he carried himself. A quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Azrael lunged at the mirror, slamming his palms against the glass. "Let me out!" The other Azrael smirked. He lifted his hand and pressed it against the glass, mirroring Azrael's movements. "I told you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You already are." Azrael's stomach twisted. What does that mean? The imposter tilted his head, studying him with an almost curious expression. Then he let out a slow, amused chuckle. "You always knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "That something was wrong. That something was watching." Azrael shook his head, his pulse pounding. "This is a nightmare." "No," the imposter said, stretching his arms, rolling his shoulders like he was adjusting to a new body. "This is a second chance." Then he turned and walked away. "No!" Azrael pounded on the mirror. "Come back!" But the imposter didn't stop. He crossed the room, picked up Azrael's phone, and casually scrolled through his messages as if he had lived in that body his entire life. Azrael's breath came in sharp gasps. He slammed his fists against the glass. "That's my life. You can't just take it." The other Azrael turned back, smiling. "But I already have." Then he left the room. Azrael screamed. Time lost all meaning. There was no night, no day, no sleep, no hunger. Azrael wandered the mirror version of his apartment, but nothing changed. The air was stagnant, thick with an eerie silence. It felt like a limbo, a space that existed between realities but belonged to neither. He screamed until his voice was raw. No one heard him. Then, slowly, the shadows came. At first, they were just flickers in his peripheral vision, like shifting darkness at the edges of the room. But soon, they became more. Shapes. Figures lurking in the corners, watching, waiting. Azrael tried to convince himself they weren't real, that they were just tricks of his exhausted mind. But then, one night, if it could even be called night, one of them stepped forward. He saw it. A tall, twisted silhouette, its limbs too long, its body flickering like a distorted image on a broken screen. It had no face, no eyes, just a void where a mouth should have been. And yet, it whispered, "Azrael." His body went rigid. Cold terror washed over him. He stumbled backward, his back pressing against the glass of the mirror. "What?" His voice cracked. "What do you want?" The thing tilted its head, its jagged form shifting unnaturally. The whisper came again, from everywhere and nowhere. "To trade." Azrael's breath hitched. He glanced back at the mirror. His real world. His life. It was right there, just beyond the glass. He could see the apartment, his desk, the empty beer bottle he had left behind. He turned back to the shadow. "What do you mean?" It stepped closer. Another shape emerged from the darkness. Then another, and another. Azrael's pulse thundered. They were all like him. People, or what was left of them. Trapped. Their forms flickered like remnants of a distorted reality, lost echoes of those who had come before. One of them, a woman with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, reached for him. Her voice was a breath of wind, barely a sound. "Please," she whispered. "It takes time." Azrael recoiled, horror seizing his chest. The first shadow moved again, closer now. Its voice was soft, sickly sweet. "You don't have to stay." Azrael's breath came in ragged gasps. "I don't trade." The thing's voice slithered into his ear. "Find another. Trade." The realization struck him like a physical blow. That's how the imposter got out. That's how they all got out. Azrael looked at the woman again, the hollow-eyed figure who had reached for him. How long had she been here? Years? Decades? Had she once been like him, desperate, afraid, tricked into taking someone else's place? His stomach churned. The whispers pressed in around him. More voices, more figures, all of them waiting, all of them hoping. Asriel's blood ran cold. He understood now. He wasn't the first to be trapped here. The thing in the mirror, his reflection, the imposter, he had been someone else before. Someone who had escaped, and the only way out was to take someone else's place.
Here in the wild, the terrors never truly vanish. They're always watching, waiting. If you dare to face them again, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You never know when the next nightmare will find you. Until then, stay safe or stay scared.